Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the real story behind the Russo-Japanese War, one of the most underestimated turning points in modern history. Here's the question you probably haven't asked: how did a relatively new industrial power like Japan manage to defeat a massive European empire? And why does that moment still ripple through global politics today? To understand that, we need to set the stage at the turn of the 20th century, an era bubbling with imperial rivalries, industrial revolutions, and rising nationalism, especially in East Asia. Let's start with the big picture. The late 1800s was a time of aggressive colonial expansion. European powers, like Britain, France, and Russia, weren't just carving up Africa. They were pushing deep into Asia. These weren't polite negotiations. This was a full-contact scramble for influence, trade routes, and raw materials. Think of East Asia as a chessboard where everyone wanted to control the center. Russia, in particular, had its eye on Manchuria and Korea. Why? Well, Russia had a cold problem, literally. Their main ports in the north were iced over much of the year. Access to warm water ports in the Pacific was a strategic dream. But that dream came at a cost. It meant extending influence into territories that Japan also saw as vital to its own future. Now here's where Japan's story takes a fascinating turn. Just a few decades earlier, Japan was a feudal society, cut off from the world. But the Meiji Restoration changed everything. Japan went from samurai swords to modern factories, steel warships, and national railways in the blink of a historical eye. This wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. Fukuzawa Yukikai, one of Japan's most influential thinkers, famously called for Japan to escape from Asia. What did he mean? He wasn't talking about geography. He meant mindset. He believed Japan needed to break from stagnant regional traditions and align with the more modern, industrial, and Western models of progress. That idea lit a fire under Japan's transformation. So now, picture the contrast. Russia, still ruled by a Tsar, clinging to a rigid autocracy with layers of slow-moving bureaucracy. And Japan, young but dynamic, pushing rapid reform through a centralized but highly competent government. One empire looking backward, the other sprinting forward. This wasn't just a clash of militaries, it was a clash of systems, of old power versus new purpose. And as these two collided in East Asia, the world was about to learn that global dominance wasn't reserved for the West anymore. So, how exactly did this conflict ignite into full-scale war? What pushed Japan and Russia to the breaking point? Well, let's begin with one word: overreach. Russia's ambitions were enormous, stretching across the endless frozen expanse of Siberia all the way to the warm shores of Manchuria and Korea. On paper, it was a bold imperial strategy. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Picture it: moving troops, supplies, and command orders across thousands of miles on a single rail line, all while juggling political instability back home. The Russian Empire wasn't expanding from strength, it was stretching itself thin, and the seams were starting to show. Now enter Japan, fresh off a rapid-fire modernization sprint. With new industries humming and a powerful navy in place, Japan wasn't just defending its interests, it was asserting them. And remember, this wasn't just about pride, it was about security. Japan saw the encroachment of foreign powers, especially Russia, as an existential threat. If they didn't draw a line in the sand, someone else would draw it for them. But Japan wasn't acting alone. Behind the scenes, they had a quiet but crucial ally, Britain. In 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed. And let's be honest, this wasn't out of love. Britain wanted to keep Russian ambitions in check, especially in Asia. And Japan? They needed international legitimacy and breathing room. That treaty gave them both. It was like a diplomatic green light wrapped in velvet gloves. So let's rethink the popular narrative. This wasn't just Japan acting out of aggression or expansionist zeal. Japan was fighting for its place in a world order designed to exclude them. In a system dominated by Western empires, Japan saw itself boxed out, denied respect, denied sovereignty, and denied security. For Japan, war wasn't about ambition, it was about survival. It was a gamble, a high-stakes bet that it could carve out its own path before being swallowed by the very forces that had colonized so much of Asia already. This is where the fuse was lit, not just by soldiers or ships, but by strategy, fear, alliances, and the pressure of being the only non-Western power trying to play a game with rules it didn't write. And as the pieces moved into place, the world stood at the edge of a historical shockwave. Once the war began, it didn't take long to see this wasn't going to be your average imperial clash. This wasn't just about who had the biggest guns. It was about who knew how to use them. Let's start with the water, because that's where Japan stunned the world. The Battle of Tsushima was a masterclass in naval warfare. Japan's fleet, under Admiral Togo, didn't just win, it dominated. Russian ships sailed halfway across the globe, exhausted, underprepared, and poorly coordinated. Meanwhile, the Japanese navy moved like clockwork, trained, efficient, and autonomous. They weren't waiting around for permission from faraway officials. Their system empowered officers to act decisively. That kind of command flexibility isn't just tactical, it's cultural. And then there's the logistics. War is chaos, but Japan brought order. They built and maintained supply chains across difficult terrain with stunning precision. Their troop movements were calculated. Their timing was razor-sharp. This level of discipline meant they could fight not just hard, but sustainably. Even far from home, they never lost control of the pace. Now compare that with Russia. The empire still relied on outdated infrastructure, especially its railroads. You can't move an army faster than the trains can carry it. And Russia's trains? Let's just say they weren't winning any speed records. Add to that a top-down military structure where field commanders couldn't make fast decisions, and you have a recipe for paralysis. The gears of war were turning, but slowly, and with sand in the cogs. But there was something else Japan brought to the battlefield: narrative power. They didn't just fight for territory, they framed the entire war as a civilizational showdown. East versus West. Japan versus centuries of imperial condescension. This wasn't about land, it was about respect. And that message resonated deeply with the Japanese people, boosting morale and fueling a national commitment to victory. Russia, on the other hand, couldn't even get its own citizens to fully care. So no, Japan didn't win because of luck. They won because their system worked. Their strategy was clear. Their institutions were competent. Their people were united. And as the dust settled, the world would soon realize that this wasn't just a Japanese victory, it was a collapse of Western assumptions. When the final shots were fired and Russia sued for peace, the battlefield may have quieted, but the world was thundering. This wasn't just a victory, it was a global earthquake. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire in full-scale warfare. That shattered a centuries-old illusion, the myth of Western invincibility. Suddenly, the idea that the West was naturally dominant, morally superior, or technologically untouchable, collapsed. Japan's win wasn't just a headline, it was a symbol, a new possibility. Across colonized nations, the effect was electric. Leaders like Sun Yat-sen in China and a young Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa saw Japan's victory as proof that empire wasn't destiny. That sovereignty wasn't a European birthright. That resistance wasn't futile. For them, Japan wasn't just a country, it was a spark. It said, you can fight back, you can modernize, you can win. And this terrified Europe. Capitals from Paris to London to Berlin began re-evaluating everything, from military strategy to racial ideology. If a non-white nation could sink Russian battleships and hold its own on the world stage, then what else had they gotten wrong? What followed wasn't just admiration, it was fear. Fear that the imperial order they'd carefully constructed might not be as stable as they thought. Fear that colonies might start dreaming bigger. And worst of all, fear that Japan was only the beginning. The dominoes of doubt had been tipped. Japan's victory marked a moment where the world order itself blinked, where the so-called natural hierarchy cracked, and everyone noticed. Now let's flip the lens and look at what this war did inside Russia. Because while Japan was rising, Russia was unraveling. See, losing a war is one thing, but losing a war like this, to a so-called lesser power, on foreign soil, with global eyes watching, was a humiliation the Tsarist regime couldn't hide from. It didn't just sting, it fractured the empire's internal foundations. The Russian people weren't blind. They saw the incompetence. They saw their sons sent off to die in a war they didn't understand. They saw supply shortages, botched orders, military confusion, and most of all, they saw a government that couldn't deliver on its promises. The illusion of imperial strength shattered. And when an autocracy loses its myth of control, what happens next? Revolution. The war acted like a pressure cooker. Years of frustration with political repression, economic inequality, and rigid social hierarchy boiled over. In 1905, barely after the peace treaty ink dried, Russia exploded into a wave of strikes, protests, and violent unrest. This wasn't a random outburst. It was the system cracking open. And the Tsar? He tried to patch it all with half measures. The October Manifesto, a promise of reforms, a Duma that had barely any power. It was like putting a bandage on a dam with growing leaks. What this moment reveals is a deeper truth about centralized regimes. When decision-making is concentrated at the top, failure at the top infects everything beneath it. There's no room for adaptation, no built-in course correction. The war exposed how brittle the whole thing really was. The Russo-Japanese War didn't just defeat Russia on the battlefield. It exposed the limits of command from above. It was the beginning of a long, messy unraveling that would eventually culminate in a far more earth-shaking revolution just a decade later. So, Japan had won. The world was watching, and for a moment, just a moment, it looked like the dream of an enlightened, independent, non-Western power had come true. But here's where the story turns. Japan's victory over Russia wasn't just a military win, it was a validation of their entire modernization model. Rapid industrialization, centralized reform, military investment, national unity, it all worked. And with that success came new confidence and new ambition. At first, Japan's post-war moves looked like pragmatic power projection. They secured Korea, tightened influence over Manchuria, and flexed their newfound clout at the global table. But slowly, subtly, that drive for self-preservation began morphing into something else: control. Instead of championing mutual development in Asia, Japan began building its own imperial network. Colonies, puppet governments, resource extraction. The very playbook used by the European powers Japan had once sought to defend against was now being written in Japanese. And let's be clear, this wasn't inevitable. Japan had a choice. Would they model an alternative path of modernization without domination, or would they join the imperial club and enforce their will with steel and script? History tells us which direction they chose. The same centralized efficiency that fueled Japan's rise also enabled its slide into authoritarianism. Militarists gained influence. Dissent narrowed. The government's energy shifted from national development to regional dominance. And as Japan's empire expanded, its legacy grew heavier, with consequences that would ripple through the entire 20th century. So yes, Japan's rise was impressive, but it came with a cost. The very system that had once protected Japan from foreign domination now began to impose its will on others. And in that shift, from defender to occupier, we see the double-edged nature of power. It can liberate, or it can consume. So what does all this mean for us now? Well, fast forward a century, and look around. The center of gravity in global affairs is drifting back toward Asia. Economically, politically, and culturally, the so-called periphery is no longer sitting quietly at the margins. And that shift? It's not random. The Russo-Japanese War marked the first real crack in the Western monopoly on power. It didn't just reshuffle military rankings, it disrupted the narrative that only Western nations could define progress, modernity, or legitimacy. That ripple effect never really stopped. Today, we see echoes of that moment all over the world. Asian economies like China, South Korea, India, and yes, Japan, have become powerhouses. But it's not just about GDP, it's about systems, governance models, cultural diplomacy, infrastructure projects, trade alliances, soft power. Nations across Asia are now shaping global institutions, not just reacting to them. But here's the twist: these rising powers don't always follow the Western liberal playbook. Some blend markets with tight state control. Others invest heavily in national identity, centralized planning, or regional influence. And whether you see that as a strength or a warning sign depends on what lens you're using. What matters is that the assumptions from a century ago, about who leads, who follows, and who gets to write the rules, are being rewritten. And if we trace that thread back, it leads us to a quiet port in East Asia, where Japan, once dismissed and underestimated, beat an empire and forced the world to take notice. History doesn't repeat, but it does echo. And today's shifting balance of power is one of the clearest echoes yet. Let's step back. The Russo-Japanese War wasn't just a regional conflict. It was a stress test, a real-world experiment that exposed how systems succeed or fail. Japan didn't win because it was lucky. It won because it had built a system that could respond, adapt, and act with purpose. It aligned incentives, economic, military, political, toward a shared goal. It modernized, not just in tools, but in mindset. Russia, on the other hand, collapsed under the weight of its own structure. An empire stretched thin, ruled from the top down, with no feedback loop and no way to course correct. When cracks formed, there were no mechanisms to fix them, only to delay the inevitable. And in that contrast, we see a broader truth. History is shaped not just by great leaders or dramatic battles, but by how institutions function, how incentives are aligned, and how much room a system leaves for individual agency. When power is concentrated and adaptation is stifled, even the mightiest empire can fall. When initiative is rewarded and competence allowed to rise, even the underestimated can rise to global power. That's not just a story from 1905. That's a warning and a lesson for today. So the next time we talk about war, or power, or why one nation rises while another fades, don't just look at headlines. Look at the systems, the structures, the invisible mechanics, because that's where history really happens. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we think about the past. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link's in the description. I'll see you in the next one, where we keep asking the hard questions and following the truth wherever it leads.